A mother German shepherd stepped out of the snowy woods with something tiny in her mouth. Not food, not a toy. A puppy. A Navy SEAL stopped his old truck in the middle of the winter road, watching as the exhausted mother placed the trembling pup at his feet, then vanished back into the trees. Minutes later, she returned with a second puppy, but when he opened the door and whispered for her to come inside, she refused. She only stood in the snow, looking back toward the forest again and again. What was waiting for her out there? Why would a mother save her puppies, then leave them behind? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Winter mornings settled over Ironwood Falls, Wisconsin, with a quiet so deep it seemed to have weight. Snow drifted over the farm road north of town, softening the fences, whitening the ditches, and turning the pine woods into a wall of pale green and silver. The road was almost empty, the kind of road where a man could drive for miles without meeting another soul, which was exactly why Luke Harris preferred it. Luke was 45, a former Navy SEAL with broad shoulders, a hard, athletic frame, and the kind of square, weathered face that made strangers lower their voices around him without knowing why. His dark brown hair was cut short, with gray showing at the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a jaw that looked carved more by discipline than by kindness. People in Ironwood Falls called him dependable, which was a polite way of saying he fixed what was broken, and left before anyone could ask how he was doing. He wore an authentic Navy working uniform Type 3 in green, gray, brown camouflage as a daily non-combat uniform, the fabric soft and unarmored. No tactical vest, no plate carrier, no body armor. He was not driving toward danger that morning. He was driving toward coffee, nails, a replacement hinge, and the ordinary errands of a man who had built his life around not needing anyone. Yet some mornings do not ask permission before becoming a turning point. Luke's old black pickup rolled slowly along the snowy road, its heater rattling, its windshield wipers scraping at the falling flakes. He kept one hand on the wheel and the other around a paper list he had written before sunrise. The list was simple: coffee, kerosene, hinge, dog food for no dog at all. He had written that last item by mistake, then crossed it out so hard the pen nearly tore the paper. Years ago, Luke had worked with dogs in places where loyalty meant life or death, and after losing more than he cared to name, he had decided that love with 4 legs was still love, and love always found a way to leave teeth marks on the heart. His mother, Eleanor Harris, had once told him that a house without something to care for became a cave. Eleanor had been a small, graceful woman with warm brown eyes, silver-streaked chestnut hair, and hands always busy with thread, bread dough, or some small act of mercy. She had died before Luke made it home from his final deployment. Since then, every warm memory of her had carried a cold edge. The first sign that something was wrong was not movement, but stillness. At a bend where the road narrowed between 2 snowbanks, a German shepherd mother stood directly in front of the pickup. Luke pressed the brake. The truck groaned to a stop. The dog did not bark. She did not run. She stood with snow clinging to her black and tan coat, ribs faintly visible beneath wet fur, her body lean and exhausted, but her posture strangely royal, like a queen who had lost everything except the right to choose her final act. She looked about 5 years old, maybe younger if hunger had not sharpened her face. Her ears were alert but trembling. Her brown eyes were tired, watchful, and terribly clear. In her mouth hung a tiny German shepherd puppy, no more than 6 or 7 weeks old, limp with cold but still breathing. Luke sat frozen behind the wheel for one long second. He had seen men hesitate before impossible choices. He had felt hesitation in himself. But he had never seen a mother carry surrender so carefully between her teeth. Luke opened the truck door and stepped out slowly, boots sinking into fresh snow. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low. The German shepherd mother took 3 steps forward, Around her neck was a red thread of yarn, frayed, wet, and tied in a loose knot. It looked too delicate to belong in that hard white morning, a little flame refusing to die. The mother dog lowered her head and placed the puppy in the snow just in front of Luke's boots. Then she backed away. Not far, just enough to say there were rules. Luke crouched. The puppy was a German shepherd, black and tan, with a round muzzle, closed-looking sleepy eyes, and tiny paws that twitched against the cold. The little body felt like a bundle of wet cloth, except for the faint flutter of breath beneath Luke's fingers. Something in Luke's chest tightened with an old, unwelcome tenderness. "All right," he murmured. "I've got you." He carried the puppy to the pickup and placed the tiny body on the passenger seat, tucking his coat around it. The puppy made one thin sound, no louder than a hinge complaining in the wind. Luke turned back toward the road just as the mother dog spun and disappeared into the trees. "No," Luke said under his breath, already knowing he would wait. He stood beside the open truck door, snow gathering on his shoulders, anger rising in him for no sensible reason. He was angry at the cold, at the empty road, at every passing vehicle that must have gone by before him. And perhaps most of all, at himself, because the moment he had touched that puppy, his day had stopped belonging to him. Several minutes passed. Then the mother dog returned from the pines, slower this time. In her mouth was a second German shepherd puppy, smaller than the first, darker across the back, its little head hanging weakly. The mother dog placed this second puppy near the front tire and nudged the tiny body toward Luke with her nose, as if pushing a treasure across an altar. Luke picked up the second puppy with both hands. This one was colder, too quiet. "Come on," he whispered, rubbing gently through the wet fur. "Stay with me." He placed the second puppy beside the first under his coat, then opened the passenger door wider and looked at the mother dog. "Get in," he said. "I'll take all three of you." For a moment the German shepherd mother stepped closer. Her eyes moved from Luke's face to the two puppies trembling beneath the coat. Her whole body leaned toward them, and Luke could see the battle in her, instinct pulling her forward, some other duty dragging her back. When Luke took one step toward her, she gave a low growl. It was not a threat. It was a boundary drawn by a creature too tired to explain herself. "Save them. Do not hold me." Miles away in the small town center, Helen Brooks unlocked the door of Brooks Second-Hand and Sundries, the narrow shop she had run for 23 years. Helen was 72. Short and slightly stooped, with soft brown skin weathered by Wisconsin winters, bright gray eyes behind round glasses, and white hair pinned into a loose bun that never survived the morning. She was known for rescuing chipped teacups, widowed neighbors, and church arguments before they became wars. On the doorstep sat a brown paper bag dusted with snow. Inside was old red yarn, the same deep shade Eleanor Harris had once bought to knit a scarf for Luke. Beneath the yarn lay a torn note in shaky handwriting. "If the dog brings her pups to town, don't make her stay." Helen read the words twice, and the bell above her shop door trembled softly, though no one had entered. Back on the farm road, Luke stood beside the pickup with two freezing puppies under his coat, and the mother dog watching from the edge of the trees. The snow fell between them like a curtain neither one knew how to lift. "I'm not the right man for this," Luke said quietly. The German shepherd mother only looked at him one last time. Then she turned, the red thread on her neck flashing once against the white, and vanished into the forest. Luke climbed into the truck, shut the door gently, and turned the heater higher. The puppies shivered beneath his coat. He rested one broad hand over them, feeling for breath, for warmth, for any sign that the morning had not already asked too much. Outside, the snowy road curves toward town. Inside the truck, two small lives trembled under a soldier's hand. And Luke Harris, who had spent years avoiding anything that needed him, did not drive away until he was sure both puppies were still alive. By late morning, the snow had thickened over Ironwood Falls, falling in small, restless bursts that made the road ahead look unfinished. Luke Harris drove with both hands on the wheel, slower than he normally would, because two tiny German Shepherd puppies were trembling beneath his coat on the passenger seat. The larger one kept making weak, irritated sounds, as if offended by being rescued in such undignified fashion. The smaller one made almost no sound at all, and that silence frightened Luke more than any cry would have. He had carried wounded men who cursed, prayed, laughed, and begged, but silence had always been the language that made his blood run cold. Every few seconds he glanced down to check the slight rise and fall beneath the coat. "Stay with me," he muttered. Not because the puppies understood him, but because a man sometimes speaks to the helpless to keep his own fear from growing teeth. The Pine Ridge Animal Clinic sat at the edge of town in a squat brick building with a green metal roof, a wooden sign shaped like a paw print, and yellow light glowing in every window. It was not fancy, but it looked stubbornly alive against the snow. Luke parked crookedly near the entrance, scooped both puppies into his arms, and shouldered the door open with more force than necessary. A bell rang overhead. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic, damp coats, and old dog biscuits. Behind the counter stood Dr. Karen Wells, 50 years old, tall and lean, with copper-brown hair streaked with gray and pinned in a practical knot at the back of her head. Her face was narrow, sun-lined, and serious, but not cold. She wore square glasses low on her nose, green scrubs beneath a cream cardigan, and the expression of a woman who had been awakened too many times by emergencies to waste energy on surprise. Karen had run the clinic for nearly 20 years, and people said she could calm a biting dog, a panicked farmer, and a crying child with the same steady voice. She looked once at Luke, once at the bundle in his arms, and immediately came around the counter. "Exam room," she said. No greeting, no lecture, just action. Luke followed her down the hall, his boots leaving wet prints on the clean floor. "Found them on County Road 7, he said. "Their mother brought them to me." Karen paused only half a second, then opened the exam room door with her elbow. "Brought them how?" "Carried them, one at a time, then left." Karen's mouth tightened, not with disbelief, but with the unhappy recognition of someone who knew nature could be both brutal and holy in the same breath. She spread warm towels on the metal table. "Set them here." Luke did, reluctantly. The larger puppy wriggled and tried to mouth at his glove with tiny, indignant determination. The smaller one curled inward, its damp black and tan body barely moving except for shallow breaths. Karen examined them with calm precision, pressing warm fingers against gums, ribs, bellies, paws. "Both male, 6, maybe 7 weeks old, underfed, cold, stress. The smaller one is weaker, but he's still fighting." Luke looked at the smaller puppy. "Doesn't look like fighting." Karen glanced up. "Sometimes fighting looks like not leaving yet." That sentence found a place under Luke's ribs and sat there heavily. He did not like poetic answers from practical people. They were harder to dismiss. Karen wrapped the puppies in heated towels and prepared warm fluids. She worked without fuss, explaining only what Luke needed to know. The larger puppy complained at every indignity, pawing weakly at the towel and blinking with offended little eyes. The smaller puppy tucked his face toward Luke's wrist when Luke leaned too close, seeking warmth with the blind trust of something too young to have learned disappointment. Luke pulled his hand back at first. Then, after a long second, he let the puppy rest there. "Why would she leave them?" he asked. Karen did not answer quickly. She finished checking the smaller puppy's temperature, then said, "A mother dog does not do that because she forgets she's a mother. She does it because something is wrong. Injured? Maybe. Starving? Sick? Or she belongs to someone who can't help her anymore." Karen looked at him over her glasses. "Sometimes an animal makes a better decision than the people around her." Luke thought of the cars he had not seen but imagined, Passing trucks, warm heaters, clean windshields, drivers who looked away. He thought of the mother dog's red thread flashing against the snow before she vanished. She wouldn't let me touch her. Good, Karen said. That means she still had enough strength to choose. While the puppies warmed, Luke stood in the corner like a man waiting to be dismissed from a place he had never meant to enter. He still wore his authentic Navy working uniform Type 3 in green-gray-brown camouflage, soft and unarmored. No tactical vest, no plate carrier, no body armor, just the daily uniform he found easier than choosing ordinary clothes. The fabric was damp at the cuffs. His beard held melted snow. His broad shoulders seemed too large for the small exam room. Karen had known men like Luke before. Men who could carry weight, follow orders, fix engines, clear trees, and still become helpless in the presence of a small creature needing tenderness. You can take them home tonight if you can keep them warm and feed them every few hours, she said. Or I can keep them here. Luke answered too quickly. I'm not keeping them. Karen lifted one eyebrow. I didn't say you were. One night, he said. I'll take them for one night. After that, you find someone with a fenced yard and too much patience. The larger puppy sneezed into the towel as if offering his opinion. Karen almost smiled. A lot of families start with one night. Across town, Helen Brooks had locked the door of Brooks' Second Hand and Sundries and carried the paper bag of red yarn to the church basement, where the Wednesday knitting circle had gathered despite the snow. The room smelled of coffee, lemon polish, and old hymnals. 6 women sat around a long folding table, their needles clicking like tiny clocks. Helen, 72, short, soft-faced, and stronger than her careful steps suggested, placed the bag on the table. I need you ladies to look at something. Martha Lane, 81, bird-boned and sharp-eyed, with a long silver braid pinned around her head like a crown that had survived several wars of gossip, picked up the torn note first. Martha had taught 3rd grade for 40 years and still spoke as though every sentence might be on a spelling test. She narrowed her pale blue eyes. This looks like Ruth Miller's hand. The room went quieter. Ruth Miller was 79, a retired Army nurse who lived alone north of town near Loon Ridge Road. She was remembered as tall once, though age had bent her, with iron-gray hair, a stern mouth, and hands that had soothed soldiers, children, calves, and dying neighbors with equal firmness. Ruth had been close to Eleanor Harris, Luke's mother, back when Eleanor still came to church carrying baskets of muffins and red yarn. But Ruth had not been seen in town for months. Are you sure? Helen asked. Martha tapped the note. Not sure enough for a courtroom, sure enough for a casserole. By evening, Luke drove home with powdered milk formula, instructions written in Karen's blunt handwriting, and 2 puppies asleep in a box lined with towels on the seat beside him. The house felt different the moment he carried them inside. Not warmer, exactly, more breakable. He set the box near the wood stove, fed them clumsily, spilled formula on his sleeve, cursed under his breath, and apologized to no one in particular. The larger puppy fought the bottle, then drank as if victory had always been the plan. The smaller puppy needed patience, a slower hand, a quieter room. Luke gave him all 3 and pretended not to notice. Later, when the house settled into darkness, he sat on the floor beside the box, back against the sofa, listening to their tiny breaths. He did not name them. Naming made things real. Naming gave grief an address. On the 3rd night, the wind pressed hard against the windows, and both puppies woke at once. The larger one lifted his head, the smaller one turned toward the door. Luke rose, every old instinct suddenly awake. Outside the glass stood the German shepherd mother, covered in snow, eyes fixed on her puppies. For a moment no one moved. Luke opened the door, slowly. She did not come in. She lowered her head, placed a short piece of frayed red yarn on the threshold, looked past Luke toward the sleeping box by the stove, and then turned back toward the dark woods. Luke stood in the doorway, cold rushing around his bare feet, and understood only one thing with certainty. Whatever had brought her back was not finished. Morning came to Ironwood Falls with a pale sky and a hard cold that made every fence post glitter like bone china. The storm had thinned during the night, leaving the farm road quiet under a new skin of snow. And Luke Harris stood in his kitchen, staring at the red thread the mother dog had left on his threshold. It lay on the table beside Dr. Karen Wells's feeding instructions, a short, frayed piece of yarn no longer than his hand, but somehow heavier than a warning. Near the wood stove, the two nameless German Shepherd puppies slept in a towel-lined box. The larger one twitched as if chasing a heroic dream in which he had already conquered the blanket. The smaller one slept curled against his brother's belly, breathing shallowly but steadily. Luke had been awake most of the night, feeding them warm formula, changing towels, and telling himself each small act did not mean attachment. But denial, he was beginning to learn, could look very foolish when it was holding a baby bottle at 2 in the morning. He packed before sunrise. Rope, flashlight, first aid kit, emergency blanket, water, dog food, spare gloves, a folding knife, and a radio that probably would not work well under the pines. He moved with the old precision of a man who trusted preparation more than hope. Before leaving, he fed the puppies again and set them in a deeper box near the stove, then checked the latch twice. "This is not adoption," he told them. The larger puppy yawned in his direction with magnificent disrespect. Luke almost smiled, which annoyed him more than a sleeplessness. He drove back toward County Road 7 with the red thread tucked in his chest pocket, close enough that he could feel it whenever he breathed. He did not like that, either. The place where the mother dog had first appeared looked different in daylight, smaller and more ordinary, which somehow made it worse. Snow softened the tire ruts, but Luke could still see where his pickup had stopped. He crouched near the ditch and studied the ground. Tracks told the truth when people did not. The German Shepherd mother's paw prints were faint but readable near the edge of the road. One set coming from the trees, one set returning. Then another pair of paths where she had carried the second puppy. There was drag where her body had lowered from exhaustion. There were places where she had paused. Luke followed slowly, careful not to step over what little the snow had left him. The trail led through a break in the fence, past a sagging wire gate, and into the pine woods, where sound became softer, and the world narrowed to white ground, dark trunks, and his own breath. The woods did not frighten him. What troubled Luke was the feeling that he was following a decision made by someone with no words. Every mark in the snow said the mother dog had known exactly where she was going, not wandering, not panicking, not lost. She had carried one puppy, returned for the other, and spent whatever strength remained to reach a road where humans passed. That thought stayed with him like a stone in his boot. Half a mile in, the trees opened near an abandoned rail line, its rusted tracks half buried beneath snow. Beside it stood an old farm shed, gray boards leaning inward, roof bowed under ice, one door hanging crooked from a single hinge. It looked less like a building than a tired animal that had lain down and forgotten to rise. Inside, the air smelled of old hay, damp wood, and dog. Luke swept his flashlight across the floor. He found black and tan fur caught on a splintered plank, paw marks near the wall, a flattened corner of burlap where something had rested, and a torn piece of blanket stiff with cold. A few crumbs of dry food lay scattered near an overturned coffee can. On several nails along the boards, bits of red yarn clung like tiny flags after a lost parade. The mother dog had been here, but not for long. This was not a den. It was a stop between danger and the road. Luke crouched near the burlap and pressed 2 fingers lightly to the shape left in the dust and snow. He could almost see her there, ribs moving, puppies pressed close, waiting for a break in the weather, waiting for the kind of chance no mother should have to gamble on. Near the entrance, Luke noticed the tire marks, not his. The snow had crusted over older tracks, the wide tread of a truck, the narrower lines of a sedan. Another vehicle that had stopped only long enough to leave a half-moon of compressed slush before pulling away. He stood very still. It was one thing to know the road was traveled. It was another to see the proof. Before he had stopped, others had passed. Maybe they had not understood what they were seeing. Maybe they were late for work, afraid of strays, afraid of responsibility, afraid of being pulled into a story that might cost them an afternoon. Luke had spent years learning not to judge people too quickly. Fear wore many coats. Still, the truth stood there in the snow with ugly patience. The mother dog had been seen, and someone had kept driving. He searched the shed more carefully after that. Behind a cracked feed bin, he found a pair of women's gloves, brown wool worn thin at the fingertips. One glove had a button missing. Beside it lay an empty orange prescription bottle with the label mostly scratched away, but the first name, Ruth, remained clear enough to tighten the air around him. A folded scrap of paper had been wedged between two boards, damp but legible. On it, written in a trembling hand, was an address: Loon Ridge Road. Luke turned the paper over. Nothing else. Then his flashlight caught marks on the wall near shoulder height, not random scratches, but letters carved hurriedly into the old wood. Tell Luke the scarf was never finished. The words struck harder than he expected. For a few seconds, the shed, the tracks, the cold, even the sleeping puppies waiting at home seemed to fall away. He saw his mother Eleanor at the kitchen table years ago, small and graceful in her blue cardigan, chestnut hair already silvering at the temples, red yarn pooled in her lap. A man who runs toward trouble still needs something warm when he comes home, she had said. He had laughed then, kissed the top of her head, promised he would be back before winter settled in. He had not been. By the time he returned, the chair was empty, the yarn gone, and everyone had spoken gently, which was worse than being blamed. Luke touched the carved words without meaning to. "Who wrote this?" he whispered. The shed gave no answer. In town, Helen Brooks sat in the church basement with a cardboard archive box open before her, dust on her sleeves and worry in the lines around her eyes. Beside her, Martha Lane adjusted her round spectacles and held up an old photograph. In it, Eleanor Harris stood smiling beside Ruth Miller, both women younger, both holding bright red yarn. At Ruth's feet sat a young female German shepherd with intelligent eyes and a proud black and tan coat. Helen ran one finger over the edge of the picture. She remembered Eleanor saying once, almost jokingly, "A dog saved at the right time can save a whole house later." Back then, Helen had thought it only sounded pretty. Now it felt like a door opening in a room she had not known existed. By the time Luke left the shed, the afternoon had begun to darken. The woods had turned blue at the edges, and snow started falling again in fine, careful flakes. He slipped the prescription bottle, gloves, and address into his pack, then stepped back toward the rail line. At the far edge of the trees stood the German shepherd mother. Snow dusted her back. The red thread around her neck showed faintly against her fur. She did not run from him, but she did not come closer. She simply watched long enough for Luke to understand that the shed was not the answer. It was only the first door. Then she turned and walked deeper into the pines, looking back once as if inviting him to decide whether he was the kind of man who stopped only once, or the kind who kept following after the easy mercy was done. The next morning, Ironwood Falls lay under a brittle winter light, the kind that made every roofline shine but gave no warmth. Luke Harris left the two German Shepherd puppies at Pine Ridge Animal Clinic before heading north, because Dr. Karen Wells had looked at him over her square glasses and said, "You cannot search the woods and feed them every few hours at the same time." Luke had opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Because she was right, and because he hated how often care required admitting limits. The larger puppy protested being placed in the heated kennel by chewing the corner of a towel with small, offended determination. The smaller one only blinked at Luke with dark, tired eyes. as if he had already learned that departures were part of life. Luke stood there longer than he meant to. Karen, tall and calm in her green scrubs and cream cardigan, pretended to adjust a chart so he would not feel watched. When Luke finally stepped outside, he wore his authentic Navy working uniform Type 3 beneath a heavy brown winter coat, the green-gray-brown camouflage soft and unarmored, no tactical vest, no plate carrier, no body armor. Just a man dressed in old discipline, walking towards something no map had prepared him for. Loon Ridge Road began where the plowed pavement gave up. It twisted north through a narrow corridor of pines, past frozen ditches and old mailboxes leaning like tired witnesses. Luke followed the address he had found in the shed, but before the road narrowed too much, he saw her. The German Shepherd mother stood between two black spruce trees, snow dusting her black and tan coat, the red thread around her neck showing faintly like a coal under ash. Now he knew she was not merely a stray moving by accident. She appeared, vanished, then appeared again farther ahead, always at a distance, always just beyond trust. Luke did not call to her. He had learned enough by now to know that some creatures did not come closer because closeness had cost them too much. She was lean from hunger, her hips too sharp, her tail carried low. But there was a grave intelligence in the way she chose her path. She wanted him to follow. She did not want him to own the following. The house appeared so quietly that Luke almost missed it. A small log cabin sat back from the road beneath the weight of old snow, with one front window patched by cardboard, a woodpile nearly gone beneath a torn blue tarp, and a chimney that gave no smoke at all. No smoke in winter was never a small thing. Luke parked near the leaning mailbox and stepped out, listening. The German Shepherd mother moved onto the porch first, pawed once at the door, then looked back at him. The door was not locked. It was not even fully shut. Luke pushed it open with 2 fingers. "Ruth Miller?" he called. His voice sounded too large inside the little house. There was no answer at first, only the thin ticking of a wall clock and the dry scrape of wind along the eaves. Then a woman's voice came from the next room, rough as paper. "If you're here to sell something, I already bought Too Much Life." Luke followed the voice into a sitting room where the stove had gone cold. Ruth Miller sat in a worn armchair beneath 2 quilts, her body folded into itself but not defeated. She was 79, tall once, though age and illness had bent her shoulders. Her iron-gray hair was cut short unevenly, as if she had trimmed it herself with no patience for mirrors. Her skin was pale and thin, stretched over high cheekbones, and her gray eyes were sharp despite the shadows under them. She had the face of someone who had spent a lifetime telling frightened people, "Hold still, breathe, you are not done yet," and had now become the person needing to hear it. Beside her chair sat a metal cane, a stack of old medical books, an empty water glass, and a small framed photograph of a younger Ruth in an army nurse's uniform, standing straight-backed beside men who looked grateful and afraid. The German Shepherd mother went directly to Ruth and lowered her head onto the woman's knee. Ruth's hand, blue-veined and trembling, settled on the dog's ears. "There you are, Maggie," she whispered. The name changed the room. The dog was no longer a mystery in the snow. She was someone's last companion. Luke took in the cold stove, the nearly empty wood box, the pill bottles on the side table, the blankets spread on the floor near the corner where a mother dog must have nursed 2 puppies in the freezing dark. "You need a doctor," he said. Ruth gave him a narrow look. "I was a nurse before you were a bad idea in boots." It was such a sudden, dry remark that Luke nearly laughed, and the almost laughter hurt. Ruth breathed shallowly, then closed her eyes for a moment, as if speaking cost more than pride allowed. "Flu came first, then the generator failed, then the wood ran low. I thought I could manage." Maggie pressed closer to her. Ruth looked down at the dog and her stern mouth softened. "She knew I couldn't." Ruth told it slowly, with pauses that filled the room like snowfall. Maggie had given birth during the storm. 2 pups born in the corner by the stove while Ruth shook with fever and tried to keep the fire alive. For 2 days the house had held only cold, hunger, and the stubborn breathing of 4 living things. Ruth had tried to share broth with Maggie. Maggie had refused until the puppies fed. Then the firewood was nearly gone. The formula Ruth had hoped to buy in town never came because Ruth could no longer drive. Maggie began pacing between the door and the pups.
"I told her no,"
Ruth said, her voice breaking in a place she clearly despised.
"as if mothers listen when their children are freezing."
Maggie had carried the first puppy out before dawn, then returned for the second. Ruth had been too weak to stop her.
"She went to the road because it was the only place left where people still passed."
Luke thought of the tire marks near the shed, the brief stops, the vehicles that had continued on. Ruth seemed to read the thought on his face.
"Some passed her," she said. "She came back once with snow packed around her muzzle and no puppy gone. I thought she had failed. Then she left again."
Her fingers tightened in Maggie's fur.
"She did not choose you because she knew your name, Luke Harris.
She chose you because when she came out of those woods with a pup in her mouth, you were the first man who stopped without frightening her." Luke looked away. Praise he could reject, accusation he could survive. But this was neither. It was a truth placed gently where his guilt had lived for years. He had been too late for his mother. Yet on a snowy road, for another mother, he had not been too late. "Why the red thread?" he asked at last. Maggie's ears flicked at the word, as if the thread had its own history. Ruth touched the frayed yarn around the dog's neck. For the first time, something like fear crossed her face. Not fear of Luke, fear of what memory might demand once invited in.
"It came from the scarf your mother never finished,"
Ruth said. The room went still. Luke felt his jaw tighten. Eleanor's name did not need to be spoken to enter the house. It arrived like warmth remembered from another life. Ruth's eyes dropped to her lap.
"There are letters, things she wanted you to know. I couldn't keep them here after my hands got bad and the roof started leaking. Helen Brooks has them in the church storage room."
Luke took one step back, as if distance could make the words smaller. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Ruth's answer was quiet.
"Because you were a hard man to reach, and grief made you proud."
In town, Helen Brooks stood in the church basement before a locked wooden cabinet, the old archive box at her feet. Martha Lane sat nearby with her knitting untouched in her lap. Helen held a small, tarnished tin against her chest. She did not yet know Luke had found Ruth, but she felt with the strange certainty older women earn through years of funerals, births, apologies, and casseroles, that the past had begun walking toward the door.
"Ruth told me not to give this to him until he stopped running,"
Helen murmured. Martha adjusted her spectacles.
"Then perhaps we should hope he is finally tired."
Back on Loon Ridge Road, Luke found enough split wood under the tarp to restart the stove. He moved Ruth's chair closer to the heat, checked her water, and called Dr. Karen from the porch, where the signal came and went like a nervous bird. Karen told him to bring Ruth in as soon as the road allowed. Ruth objected, of course. Maggie lifted her head and looked at Ruth with a patience so firm it bordered on command.
"Fine,"
Ruth muttered. "Betrayed by my own dog." But she stroked Maggie's head while saying it. Luke did not take anything from the cabin. No letters, no scarf, no tidy answer. Only Ruth's words followed him as he stood in that cold house with the stove beginning to breathe again. Maggie lay between Ruth and Luke, watchful, not fully trusting, not fully refusing. Luke looked at the woman who had known his mother, then at the dog who had given him 2 nameless lives, and understood that finding Ruth was not the end of the trail. It was the beginning of the part that would hurt. "Tomorrow," he said, voice low, "I'll see Helen." By the next morning, the cold over Ironwood Falls had softened from cruel to merely stubborn. and the road from Loon Ridge carried the gray-blue light of a winter day that had not yet decided whether to forgive anyone. Luke Harris drove slowly toward town, with Ruth Miller wrapped in 2 quilts on the passenger side of the back seat, her thin shoulders stiff with the insult of needing help. Maggie lay pressed against Ruth's legs, the German Shepherd mother lifting her head whenever Ruth coughed, her black and tan coat still rough from hunger, the frayed red thread resting against her neck like the last ember from a fire no one had fully put out. Behind them, in a towel-lined crate secured on the rear floorboard, the 2 unnamed German Shepherd puppies made small sounds of protest. The larger puppy chewed at the edge of the blanket with grim purpose, as if the cloth had personally offended his family honor. The smaller puppy tucked himself into the warmest corner and watched Luke whenever the truck slowed, his dark eyes too serious for such a tiny face. Luke kept one hand steady on the wheel and the other near the heater controls, adjusting the warmth again and again, though no one asked him to. Ruth noticed. "You fuss like your mother," she rasped. Luke did not answer. Some sentences were too gentle to defend against. At Pine Ridge Animal Clinic, Dr. Karen Wells met them at the side entrance with a wheelchair, a wool blanket, and the expression of a woman who had already decided argument would be wasted time. Karen, tall and narrow-faced in green scrubs beneath her cream cardigan, took in Ruth's pale skin, the shallow breathing, and the stubborn lift of the old woman's chin. "You look terrible," Karen said. Ruth squinted at her. "And you always had the bedside manner of a boot." Karen's mouth curved. "Good, you remember me." Luke learned then that Karen had once treated Ruth's old barn cat years before, a one-eyed orange creature with a temper Ruth admired. Karen helped Ruth inside, moving with brisk kindness, while Maggie followed close enough that Karen did not try to separate them. The 2 puppies were carried to the warmed kennel in the recovery room, where the larger one immediately objected to captivity, and the smaller one accepted the heat with a sigh that sounded almost human. Luke stood in the doorway longer than necessary. Karen touched his sleeve lightly. "They will be all right for a few hours." He nodded, though leaving them felt strangely like handing over a piece of his own breath. Helen Brooks was waiting at Brooks' Secondhand and Sundries when Luke arrived, though she had not known exactly when he would come. The shop smelled of cedar, old books, lavender sachets, and the kind of dust that belonged to things loved too long to be thrown away. Helen stood behind the counter in a soft purple cardigan, her white hair pinned badly enough to suggest she had redone it 3 times and lost every battle. Her round glasses hung from a chain at her chest, and her gray eyes searched Luke's face without invading it. She was a small woman, but she had the presence of a porch light. Not grand, not loud, simply impossible to ignore when the night got dark. "You found Ruth," she said. It was not a question. Luke's jaw tightened. "She said you had something." Helen nodded once, then turned the sign on the door to closed. "Then we should not do this beside a cash register and a box of chipped angels." She led him through a side door, across a narrow alley where snow had gathered in soft ridges, and into the back entrance of the old church. The church basement was dim and warm, filled with folding chairs, hymnals, canned goods for the pantry, and boxes labeled in Helen's careful handwriting. Martha Lane sat at the long table with a ball of red yarn in her lap, her silver braid coiled around her head, and her pale blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles. She looked at Luke as if grading a paper he had not known he submitted. "You look like Eleanor when you're trying not to feel," Martha said. Luke stopped. Helen gave Martha a warning glance. Martha shrugged. "I'm old, not decorative." Under other circumstances, Luke might have disliked her. Under these, he found her honesty oddly merciful. Helen unlocked a wooden cabinet near the back wall and lifted out a tarnished silver tin no larger than a shoebox. The lid was dented at one corner, and tied around it was a small piece of red yarn knotted twice. Luke stared at that knot. He had seen combat knots, sailing knots, field repairs made with wire and rope,
all meant to hold something under strain. This little knot looked as if it had been tied by someone who knew gentleness could be a kind of strength.
Helen placed a tin on the table.
"Ruth brought this to me 6 years ago," she said. "She told me not to give it to you until you stopped running from every room your mother was still in."
Luke gave a humorless breath. "That sounds like Ruth."
"It sounded like Eleanor first,"
Helen said softly.
Inside were letters, folded carefully, each one addressed to Luke in Eleanor Harris's rounded hand. Beneath them lay a strip of unfinished red knitting, soft despite the years, the rows uneven near the end where illness must have made Eleanor's hands less steady. Luke touched the top letter but did not open it right away. His hands, broad and scarred, had held weapons, ropes, broken machinery, wounded men, and now puppies small enough to fit against his palm. Yet a letter from his mother made them uncertain.
Finally, he unfolded the first page. Eleanor did not accuse him. That almost broke him faster than blame would have. She wrote of ordinary things, the old maple dropping leaves too early, Helen burning a pie and pretending it was rustic, Ruth arguing with a pharmacist, the red scarf growing longer by 2 inches. Then the words shifted. "You always knew how to run toward danger, my son. I used to be proud of that. I still am. But I hope one day you learn that staying can be brave, too. A home is not a trap, Luke. Sometimes it is only a place waiting to forgive you for leaving." Luke read 3 letters before he had to stop. The basement blurred, and he looked away toward the shelves of canned peaches and Christmas candles. Martha, for once, said nothing. Helen poured coffee into a paper cup and set it beside him without touching his shoulder. That restraint undid him more than comfort might have. In the corner, the 2 puppies had been brought from the clinic in a small crate after Karen allowed a brief visit, and they began to stir. The larger puppy wriggled free from the loose towel, found a fallen ball of red yarn and dragged it backward with the ferocity of a tiny outlaw. The smaller puppy tried to follow, stepped into Helen's knitting basket, and became stuck with only his head and 2 ears visible above a nest of wool. Helen laughed first, a warm burst that filled the basement like the stove catching flame. Martha laughed next. Luke made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but close enough to surprise him. The larger puppy tumbled against Luke's boot, still gripping the yarn. Luke looked down at him, bold eyes, square little muzzle, paws too big for his body, already convinced the world should move aside. "Buddy," Luke said before he could stop himself. The puppy sneezed, as if accepting. The room went still, but kindly still. The smaller puppy blinked from the basket, soft-faced, watchful, trembling less now that everyone had noticed him. Luke crouched and lifted him free with careful hands. "And you," he said, voice lower. "You're Charlie." The name settled over the puppy gently. Charlie pressed his nose into Luke's wrist. Helen looked down at the unfinished scarf, then at the 2 newly named lives. "Well," she said, her voice rough around the edges. "Eleanor always did believe names were a way of inviting someone to stay." That afternoon, the knitting circle gathered around the table. Helen, Martha, and the other women did not make speeches. They simply picked up the red scarf and began to work, 1 row at a time. Helen made a mistake and had to pull out 6 stitches. Martha clicked her tongue. Helen smiled through wet eyes. "Forgiveness is like knitting," she said. "Miss a row? Fix it. Don't throw the whole scarf into the fire." Luke sat with Eleanor's letters in the tin, Buddy asleep against 1 boot, Charlie curled in the crook of his arm. And for the first time in years, the memory of his mother did not feel only like a locked door. It felt like someone had left a lamp burning behind it. When Luke later returned to the clinic, Ruth was wrapped in a fresh blanket near the front window, looking frail but less ghost-like. Maggie stood beside her, ears forward as the crate with Buddy and Charlie came through the door. Luke opened it. Buddy stumbled toward his mother with clumsy joy. Charlie followed more slowly. Maggie lowered her head and licked each puppy's forehead, once then again, memorizing what she had saved by letting go. Luke waited for her to whine, to push toward the crate, to demand what was hers. She did not. Maggie stepped back to Ruth's side and leaned against the old woman's leg. Ruth's hand found the dog's neck, touching the red thread. Luke looked at the mother, the woman, and the two puppies now named in his care, and understood with a quiet ache that Maggie had not abandoned her sons. She had divided her heart exactly where each piece had the best chance to live. The week after the tin box was opened, Ironwood Falls seemed to hold its breath between winter and thaw. Snow still lay heavy along the church steps and in the ditches beside the farm roads, but the sun had begun to linger a little longer on the roofs, and water dripped from the eaves with the patient rhythm of a clock deciding whether time should move forward. Luke Harris moved through those days like a man carrying something invisible in both hands. He fed Buddy and Charlie, drove to Pine Ridge Animal Clinic, checked on Ruth Miller, and read one letter from Eleanor each night, never more than one, because even mercy could bruise if taken too quickly. He was still broad-shouldered, stern-faced, and quiet in the way former Navy SEALs often became quiet after too many loud memories. His authentic Navy working uniform, Type 3, soft green, gray-brown camouflage with no tactical vest, no plate carrier, and no body armor, had always made him look prepared for anything. But the sight of Maggie lying beside Ruth's chair left him feeling strangely unarmed. Luke wanted Maggie to come home with him. He did not say it at first. Pride dressed the wish in practical clothing. He told Dr. Karen Wells that Buddy and Charlie should know their mother. He told Helen Brooks that Maggie would have more room at his place. He told himself that a mother dog belonged near her pups because that sounded like common sense and not like loneliness asking for one more warm body in the house. But everyone saw through him. Karen saw it in the way Luke watched Maggie through the clinic room window. Helen saw it in the way he always brought 3 biscuits instead of 2. Ruth saw it most clearly, perhaps because old women who had survived disappointment learned to recognize longing even when it stood with its arms folded and pretended to be a plan. Maggie did not choose Luke. The German shepherd mother, still too lean but stronger each day, had a black and tan coat that was slowly regaining its shine, wise brown eyes, and the worn red thread still tied loosely at her neck. She greeted Buddy and Charlie with gentle, quiet devotion whenever Luke brought them near, licking their ears, nosing their bellies, letting them climb over her paws with the clumsy confidence of puppies who believed the whole world had been built low enough for them. But when Luke stood by the door and waited, Maggie always returned to Ruth. She would settle beside the old woman's chair, shoulder pressed against Ruth's shin, as if her body had become a sandbag against the flood of solitude. Ruth, pale and stubborn beneath Helen's borrowed quilt, would rest one thin hand on Maggie's head and pretend not to need her. Maggie pretended not to know better. Together, they made a small kingdom of denial and need. One afternoon, Luke finally said it aloud in the clinic parking lot, though not as a confession. She'd be better with the pups. Dr. Karen Wells stood beside him under a gray sky, tall and composed, her copper-brown hair tucked under a wool cap, square glasses catching the pale light. Karen had the kind of honesty people disliked until they needed it. Would she? Luke looked at her. She's their mother. Yes, Karen said. And Ruth is her person. The words landed badly. Luke's jaw tightened. I found Ruth. You did. I brought the pups in. You did. I can take care of them. Karen softened, but only a little. Luke, love is not a receipt. You don't collect enough good deeds and trade them for the living thing you want. He looked away, anger rising because the truth had entered without knocking. Karen continued more gently. Buddy and Charlie need you. Ruth needs Maggie. And you may need to learn that not being chosen by one heart does not mean you are being rejected by all of them. That night, Luke took Buddy and Charlie home through a road shining with half-frozen meltwater. His cabin, once orderly enough to satisfy a drill instructor and lonely enough to echo, had become a cheerful disaster. Buddy, the larger puppy, bold-eyed and square-muzzled, attacked the world as if every object were an enemy position. Bootlaces, chair legs, broom handles, the corner of the rug. He carried one of Luke's socks into the yard and stood over it with the solemn pride of a warrior claiming a flag. Charlie, smaller and softer-faced, watched everything first. He was cautious around loud sounds, and when the wind rattled the chimney, he crawled under the coffee table and looked ashamed of his fear. Luke knelt on the floor and did not drag him out. "You can stay there," he said. "No medals for pretending." Charlie blinked, then slowly crept forward until his chin rested on Luke's boot. The house changed by inches. A water bowl appeared near the stove. A towel stayed permanently by the door. A bag of puppy food leaned beside the cabinet where Luke used to keep only coffee, ammunition boxes repurposed for tools, and cans of soup he bought in bulk because cooking for one did not feel worth imagination. Now there were small tooth marks on the firewood basket, muddy paw prints on the floorboards, and one heroic disaster involving spilled formula, a loose shoelace, and Buddy sliding across the kitchen like a furry cannonball. Luke shouted once. Both puppies froze. The silence that followed struck him harder than the mess. He crouched slowly, rubbed both faces with his rough hands, and said, "That was too loud. My fault." Buddy forgave him instantly, because Buddy considered forgiveness efficient. Charlie took longer, then pressed against his knee. Luke sat there on the floor, surrounded by spilled milk and shame, understanding that gentleness was not something a man owned once and kept polished. It had to be chosen again after every sharp word. While Luke learned the geography of puppy chaos, Ruth recovered at Helen's house in town. Helen's place sat behind the second-hand shop, warm and crowded with quilts, mismatched lamps, old photographs, and the smell of cinnamon tea. Ruth complained about the softness of the guest bed, the weakness of the broth, the number of pillows, and the scandalous cheerfulness of Helen's curtains. Helen, short and steady in her lavender cardigans, ignored most of it. Maggie did not. Each morning, Maggie nudged Ruth's hand until the old woman sat up. Each afternoon, Maggie stood by the back door until Ruth agreed to step onto the porch for air. Ruth would grumble, "Bossy creature," while wrapping her coat tighter, but her cheeks slowly regained color. Helen told Martha Lane that Maggie had done what medicine had not managed. She had made Ruth necessary to the day. Martha, knitting in the corner with her silver braid pinned like a crown, said, "Being needed is sometimes the only medicine stubborn people will swallow." On the day Ruth was strong enough to return to the cabin on Loon Ridge Road, Luke drove Buddy and Charlie out to visit. He had repaired the broken window, stacked fresh firewood under the tarp, and fixed the stovepipe without mentioning it, because some men apologized best with tools. Ruth noticed anyway. "Your mother used to say you had helpful hands and an impossible mouth," she said. Luke gave her a sideways look. She was half right. Ruth smiled, tired but real. Maggie stood at the gate, ears high, body still thin but spirit steady. When Buddy and Charlie tumbled from Luke's truck, they rushed toward their mother in a storm of paws and joy. Maggie lowered herself carefully and let them climb over her. She licked Buddy's muzzle when he got too rough. She held Charlie still with her chin for a long, quiet moment, as if telling him that small did not mean forgotten. Luke watched, hands in his coat pockets, trying not to want what was not his. After a while, Maggie rose. Buddy pawed at her leg. Charlie followed her a few steps. Maggie looked at both of them, then turned and walked back to Ruth's side. There was no whine, no dramatic farewell, no broken-hearted chase down the road. Ruth's hand lowered to Maggie's neck, touching the frayed red thread. Buddy and Charlie stood beside Luke, confused but not abandoned. Luke understood then, not happily, but honestly. Maggie had not stopped being their mother. She had simply chosen to remain with the life that would fall apart without her. Holding on was one kind of love. Letting each heart live where it was most needed was another. In the quiet yard, beneath a sky beginning to thaw, Luke Harris accepted that Maggie's love had not grown smaller by being divided. It had become wise. Spring came late to Ironwood Falls, not with birdsong and flowers, but with dripping roofs, muddy roads, and snowbanks that shrank like old grudges refusing to disappear all at once. The pines behind Luke Harris's cabin breathed out cold mist each morning, and the farm road had turned from white silence into brown slush, full of tire tracks, paw prints, and the scattered evidence of two young German shepherds discovering that mud was one of God's more dangerous jokes. Buddy and Charlie were no longer the helpless pups Luke had warmed beneath his coat. They were lanky, long-legged, oversized, pawed young dogs, still growing into their ears and courage. Buddy, the larger one, had a broad chest, a dark saddle across his back, tan legs, and the reckless confidence of a creature who believed every closed door was a personal challenge. Charlie was smaller, softer through the face, with alert brown eyes, a lighter chest, and a habit of pausing before action, as if listening to the world beneath the world. Luke trained them every morning before breakfast, wearing his authentic Navy working uniform Type 3 in green, gray, brown camouflage as a daily non-combat uniform, soft and unarmored. No tactical vest, no plate carrier, no body armor, just the uniform of a man who still trusted routine when his heart felt less reliable. He taught Buddy to wait before charging forward. He taught Charlie to trust what he heard, even when fear made him want to tuck himself beneath the porch steps. In truth, Luke was being trained too. Buddy taught him that courage without patience could knock over a water bucket, a kitchen chair, and once an entire stack of firewood. Charlie taught him that fear was not always weakness. Sometimes it was simply the soul asking for one more second to understand the dark. That morning the fog came heavy. It rolled off the low fields and settled around Ironwood Falls like wool pulled over the eyes. Luke had just finished working Buddy on a stay command near the woodpile when Helen Brooks' truck came up the road, too fast for a woman who usually drove as if every pothole deserved an apology. Helen stepped out in a blue raincoat, her white hair slipping from its pins, her round glasses fogged at the edges. At 72, she was short, steady, and warm-faced, but worry had tightened her mouth into a line. "Luke?" she called, and Buddy broke his stay immediately, galloping toward her with muddy enthusiasm.
"Not now, sir,"
Helen said, pushing his large paws off her coat with the dignity of a queen resisting a friendly bear. Luke saw her hands shaking. "What happened?" Helen swallowed. "Nora Whitman is missing." Nora Whitman was 82, Helen's oldest friend and one of Ironwood Falls' quiet treasures. She was a small, delicate woman with snowy white curls, pale pink skin that bruised easily, and blue eyes that looked young whenever music played. For 40 years she had taught piano from the front room of her yellow house near the church, tapping rhythm onto children's knuckles with a pencil, and rewarding every improved scale with butterscotch candy. Since her husband Samuel died, her memory had begun to wander in uneven weather. Some days Nora could recall every hymn she had ever played. Other days she believed Samuel was still waiting for her at the old railway station, wearing his brown hat and holding 2 tickets to Chicago. Helen explained quickly. Nora had slipped out from the small assisted living home near the church just after dawn. The nurse on duty thought she was in the sitting room. A kitchen aide saw the back door unlatched. By the time anyone understood, the fog had swallowed the street. "She said yesterday she needed to meet Sam at the station," Helen whispered. "The old rail line, Luke. The one near the mill marsh." Luke did not waste words. He put Buddy and Charlie into the truck, grabbed 2 leashes, a blanket, a flashlight, and the scent cloth Helen had brought. A lavender handkerchief Nora kept tucked inside her cardigan sleeve. At the edge of town, several people had already gathered near the church. Deputy Alan Price, a broad, balding man in his late 50s with a gray mustache, kind eyes, and a voice that tried to sound firmer than it felt, was organizing volunteers. Alan had spent 28 years solving small-town trouble. Missing cattle, icy road accidents, porch thefts, family arguments that arrived wearing Sunday clothes. He respected Luke but never pushed him, which was one reason Luke respected him back. "Fog's thick near the old mill," Alan said. "Ground soft, creeks high. We don't need more people lost." Luke nodded and let Buddy smell the handkerchief. Buddy inhaled once, then again, his whole body changing. The reckless young dog vanished, and something focused stood in his place. Charlie watched Luke's face, ears lifted, waiting for the part of the world only he seemed able to hear. The search moved through town like a prayer with boots. Volunteers called Nora's name along the road, near the churchyard, behind the feed store, and down toward the old rail path. Buddy found the first sign near a broken fence, Nora's handkerchief sent on a splintered post, and one pale thread from a cardigan sleeve. He surged forward, but Luke held the leash short. "Slow is fast," Luke murmured. Buddy trembled with the desire to run, but he waited. Charlie moved beside them, not pulling, only listening. The fog made cowards of distance. Trees appeared too suddenly. The abandoned mill rose out of the gray like a shipwreck, its windows blind, its walls streaked with weather. Beyond it lay the old railway platform, half collapsed, near a marsh where spring water pooled beneath dead grass. Then Charlie stopped. His body went still from nose to tail. Buddy kept scenting forward, but Charlie turned toward the station house, a sagging wooden shelter with a rusted sign and a swollen door hanging crooked in its frame. Luke heard nothing at first, only dripping water. Then, faintly, a tap. Pause. Tap. Tap. Not a voice, a rhythm. Charlie whined once, low and urgent. "Show me," Luke said. Charlie led him to the station house. Buddy found the scent stronger there and sat hard at the door, as if pinning the place to the earth. Inside, Nora Whitman sat on the floor beneath the ticket window, wrapped in a thin gray cardigan, one shoe missing, her white curls damp with fog. She was frightened but alive, tapping her wedding ring against a jammed inner door. When she saw Luke, she blinked as if he had stepped out of an old photograph. "I was waiting for Sam," she said, voice small. Luke knelt in front of her, lowering himself so he would not tower. "I know," he said gently. "But Helen sent us. She was worried you'd miss breakfast." Nora looked at Buddy, then at Charlie, who had pressed softly against her side. "That one is listening," she whispered. "Yes, ma'am," Luke said. "He does that better than most people." By the time Deputy Price and the volunteers arrived, Nora had stopped trembling. Buddy guarded the doorway with proud seriousness. Charlie stayed against her knee until Helen reached them, breathless, muddy, and crying without caring who saw. She gathered Nora carefully, murmuring scoldings that were really gratitude. Later, when Nora was safe in the clinic and the town began calling Luke a hero, he stood outside beneath the thinning fog with Buddy and Charlie at his boots. Across the road, Ruth Miller had arrived with Maggie beside her, the old woman wrapped in a dark coat, Maggie calm and watchful, with the red thread still at her neck. Luke looked at Buddy, at Charlie, then at Maggie, who had once trusted him with 2 lives before she knew his name. "No," he said quietly, when Deputy Price praised him again. "This started with a mother who knew who to trust." Maggie sat in the morning mist, steady as an old queen without a crown, and for once, Luke let the silence stay gentle. Several weeks later, Ironwood Falls gathered in the old church, not for a parade, not for a headline, not for the kind of ceremony that made men like Luke Harris search for the nearest exit, but for coffee, apple pie, folding chairs, and the quiet need people have to stand together after something fragile has survived. Outside, the last of the winter snow clung to the shaded side of the road in gray patches, while thin sunlight touched the stained glass windows and broke into soft colors across the wooden floor. Inside, the church smelled of cinnamon, candle wax, wool, and old hymnals. Luke stood near the back wall, with Buddy and Charlie sitting at his boots. Both young German shepherds, cleaner than usual, only because Helen Brooks had threatened them with a towel, and the voice she used on stubborn church committees. Buddy, broad-chested and restless, watched every plate of pie as if assigned to guard it from invisible enemies. Charlie sat closer to Luke, calm but alert, his softer eyes following every small sound. A spoon against a cup, a chair leg scraping, Ruth Miller's careful steps near the front pew. Luke wore his authentic Navy working uniform Type 3 in green-gray-brown camouflage, soft and unarmored. No tactical vest, no plate carrier, no body armor. The familiar fabric helped him stand still. He had faced storms, gunfire, dark water, and the lonely rooms of grief. Yet a church full of kind faces still made him feel like a boy caught with his heart showing. Helen Brooks moved through the room with the determined grace of a small ship crossing busy water. At 72, with her white hair pinned loosely and her round glasses slipping down her nose, she seemed made of warmth and command in equal measure. She had placed a small handwritten sign on the table near the door that read, "Bring what you cannot carry alone." At first, people thought it was only a sweet phrase for the donation box beside it. Then Mrs. Adler, who ran the bakery and had flour on her sleeves no matter the hour, placed an unopened letter to her estranged sister inside. Deputy Alan Price added a photograph of his late father he had never found the courage to frame. Someone left a child's mitten. Someone else left a wedding program folded until the paper had softened like cloth. The box did not ask questions. Helen said that was the point. Some burdens did not need advice first. They needed a place to rest. Ruth Miller sat near the front beside Maggie, wrapped in a dark green shawl Helen insisted made her look less like a haunted fence post. Ruth had regained enough strength to walk with her cane, though pride still made every step look like an argument. Her iron-gray hair had been brushed neatly for once, her thin face still sharp but no longer ghostly. Maggie lay at her feet, the German shepherd mother stronger now, her black and tan coat filling out, her brown eyes no longer scanning every corner for disaster. The frayed red thread still rested around Maggie's neck, faded but stubborn. When Buddy and Charlie spotted their mother, Buddy thumped his tail hard enough to alarm a nearby pie plate, and Charlie leaned forward with quiet longing. Maggie lifted her head, gave them one slow blink, and settled again beside Ruth, serene as a queen who trusted the gates were open. At the front of the room, the red scarf lay folded inside the tarnished tin box. The knitting circle had finished it one row at a time. Some stitches were tighter than others. One small section leaned slightly left where Helen had talked too much while counting. Martha Lane, 81 and sharp-eyed as ever, had refused to fix it. "Mercy should not look machine-made," she had declared. "Let the scarf tell the truth." Now Helen lifted it carefully and turned toward Luke. Ruth stood beside her, one hand on her cane, the other resting briefly on Maggie's head. "Your mother began this," Helen said, her voice steady except for the places where love tugged at it. "The rest of us only helped it find its way home." Luke stepped forward. Buddy moved with him, Charlie too. No one laughed, no one hurried him. He took the scarf in both hands, and the red wool felt warmer than the room. For a moment he could almost see Eleanor Harris at the kitchen table, small, graceful, chestnut hair streaked with silver, brown eyes soft but never weak, hands moving through yarn as if every loop were a prayer for someone far away. Luke had spent years remembering the empty chair. He had forgotten the hands. Then Ruth touched the tin box. "There is one more thing," she said. Beneath the scarf lay an old photograph, its corners curled, its colors faded by time. Luke picked it up slowly. In the picture, Eleanor stood beside a younger Ruth outside the church on a winter day decades earlier. Eleanor was smiling, holding a red ball of yarn. Ruth, taller then and straight-backed in a navy coat, held the leash of a young female German shepherd with bright, intelligent eyes and a red thread tied loosely around her neck. Luke looked from the dog in the photograph to Maggie. His throat tightened. Ruth's voice softened.
Your mother found that dog half frozen behind the church after a bad storm. Everyone thought she would not live. Eleanor sat with her for 3 nights and fed her broth from a spoon. I took her in when your mother got sick. That dog became Maggie's grandmother.
The room seems to grow very still, not with shock, but with the hush that comes when a circle closes. Luke stared at the photograph, then at Maggie, then at Buddy and Charlie. Maggie had not chosen him because she knew this history. She had chosen him because he stopped correctly on a snowy road. But somewhere behind that moment, Eleanor's kindness had traveled through years, through Ruth, through a line of German shepherds, through winter itself, until it returned carrying 2 puppies and a question Luke could no longer avoid. What if forgiveness had been walking toward him long before he was ready to receive it? Luke did not make a speech. He could not. He knelt, instead, wrapped the red scarf once around his hands, and let Buddy press against one shoulder while Charlie leaned into the other. Maggie rose and crossed the small space between them. She touched her nose to the scarf, then to Luke's wrist. A brief, solemn blessing from a mother who had already given him more than he knew how to name. Ruth wiped her eyes and pretended it was dust. Helen pretended to believe her. Later, as evening settled, Luke drove away in his old pickup with Buddy and Charlie standing with their front paws on the passenger door, looking out at Maggie on the snowy road beside Ruth. Helen waved from the church steps and called, "A man with 2 puppies can't pretend to be lonely forever, Luke Harris." Luke shook his head, but the corner of his mouth moved. The red scarf lay on the seat beside him. He rested one hand on it as the church lights came on behind him, glowing low and golden against the cold. For once, his silence did not feel like a wall. It felt like a room with the door open. And somewhere inside that room, his mother's unfinished love had finally found its way home. What stays with me most is not that Maggie carried her puppies through the snow. It is that she knew when love had to let go. That is a hard lesson for human hearts. We often think love means holding on tighter, fixing everything ourselves, never admitting we are tired. But sometimes God's mercy comes through the moment we stop, listen, and choose kindness when it would be easier to drive past. Luke thought he was too late for love. Ruth thought she had become a burden. Maggie thought only of saving her little ones. Yet God took one red thread, one unfinished scarf, one mother's old act of kindness, and wove them into a quiet miracle. Maybe that is how grace often works. Not loudly, but through small mercies we almost miss. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment where you are watching from, and subscribe for more stories of love, mercy, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, and keep your heart warm in every season. Cess.